The Burning Crusade may have come to an end with the fall of the Legion, but Blizzard have another crusade which is far more destructive. For the past few years, the design team have been on a crusade for uniqueness. On the face of it, it sounds a good thing. After all, if you play a different class, you want it to be different. But I aim to demonstrate in this video how this campaign for uniqueness is just smoke and mirrors and actually harmful to the gaming experience. I recognise that not everybody shares these opinions, of course. To begin with, the current mindset assumes that there was a problem prior to Legion, as if too many classes were playing the same. Well, that isn't really true. No two classes have been the same ever, whether in vanilla, when you had one bar of useful abilities, or in MOP, where it could be argued we had our action bars bulging. The only way in which you could say any two classes have ever had similarities, well, are still present today anyway. It could be argued that the basic systems of DPS for monks, feral druids and rogues are pretty similar, with the identical resource system of energy and combo points. But beyond the things that still tie classes now, there were no commonalities that made the experience the same. Now, there are three aspects to my discussion today on uniqueness. One is the fact that we still don't have it. Two is that it's not even possible with contradictory philosophies in other aspects of class design. And three, that it is a vain pursuit and damaging to the end product. So on to the first point. We don't actually have unique abilities. All casters have some sort of castable damage spell. Making them different colours and giving them a different name doesn't stop them being identical. Moving on to more sophisticated abilities such as off-quoted abilities in the litany of the Uniqueness Crusade, they still have their twins. Charge, Blink, Waterlock, Portal, etc. There are some genuinely unique abilities for every class, of course, but there always were. The second point was the issue of unique specs as opposed to classes. We have 36 specs in the game. Think you can make all 36 play completely differently with fully unique abilities? If you do, I have a bridge to sell you. But this is the nonsense that Blizzard are promising. They would stand a much better chance of selling the uniqueness lie if they didn't stick to the mutually exclusive idea of specs within a class playing differently. Now, discussing this on stream, a number of people said that they enjoy the fact that the different specs for their class play differently, which is fine, that's an opinion, but it is degenerate design. How many times do you see a Warlock player describe themselves as a Demonology Warlock instead of just a Warlock, or Assassination Rogue rather than just a Rogue? It's one thing to identify as a role. People tend to play either tank, healer, melee DPS or range DPS depending on their preference. Some players don't have a strong preference and will switch between roles quite happily. But you shouldn't specialise beyond your role and class. Being a Demonology Warlock in a world where Affliction Warlocks reign supreme consigns you to either playing the inferior spec or playing the superior spec in an inferior way. This is of course for those doing competitive content, doesn't matter at all for those doing the easier stuff, naturally. However, if all Warlock specs had the same baseline abilities but completely different talents, you'd create a situation where a Warlock player could move seamlessly between their specs, but that each one would have different strengths and weaknesses via those very different talents. For a particular role, people would identify as their class, and you'd have a much better chance of making each class unique because you aren't trying to think up unique abilities for 36 different specs, but instead just 12 different classes. You literally slash your problems by 67%. This is how classes used to be before the modern talent system, but the talent system was never changed to make the specs within a class all play differently. They were intended to allow us to customise our strengths and weaknesses and do away with the cookie cutter talent builds. The situation we have now was never part of the plan. Finally, the damage to the end product. In order to compete in the highest level of content, for PvE at any rate, I'm not going to presume to talk about PvP, then there are certain things thrown at you. In Mythic dungeons and raids alike, there are group-wide and individual instances of heavy, unavoidable damage. For the group-wide massive damage, then a healer cooldown is usually the way to go. But some healers have tended to have the better of these. Restoration Shamers have the extremely powerful Spirit Link Totem, whereas Mistweaver Monks have, For more individual damage, then we need our own personal cooldowns. In the name of uniqueness, some classes get useful defensive cooldowns on short cooldowns, and others get them on much longer ones. Some get ones that can break mechanics, whilst others get ones that may only be used in an emergency. It's not like Blizzard don't understand the importance of having the right tools being more important than uniqueness. They know that interrupt rotations are necessary at times, and so they make sure that all melee have an interrupt on a maximum of 15-second cooldown, and off the global cooldown. So if they know that we should have the same ability for a situation that comes up 4 or 5 times in a whole expansion, then why don't we have the tools to deal with mechanics that happen on almost every fight? If they put in mechanics where heavy movement is required of everyone in the group, Why doesn't everyone have the abilities to facilitate that? If they put in mechanics that are designed to force players to look after their own health at times, rather than always relying on healers, why doesn't everyone have a moderate defensive on a cooldown short enough to use every time you get hit by those mechanics? And some people say, well, it's fine for that because, you know, some classes have their strengths. So in this situation, this class is going to shine, and this other situation, this class is going to shine. And Blizzard keep coming out with that as well. But the fact of the matter is that expansion after expansion, tier after tier, it's the same classes that shine fight after fight after fight. In particular, when you get to the toughest fights. It's the same with Mythic Plus Dungeons. It's the same classes that shine every time. A good example, waiting in battle for Azeroth, is the first instance raid boss, Talok. At frequent intervals during Phase 1 and 2, you will randomly get a debuff that means you drop a series of puddles. They need to be stacked tightly and out of the way. All it takes is a fairly weak damage reduction, and you could safely group them up closely enough and make it easier for your raid. However, some classes get an ability that they can use to remove the debuff altogether and not drop any puddles, and they can do this every time they get the mechanic. Some get an ability that helps them drop the puddles safely, but not for every time. Some get nothing at all to use when they get that mechanic. This means that those players either have to expand the coverage of the fast dwindling free floor space, or risk killing themselves to be tidier. And I'm not even going to talk about the movement required to get the puddle safe. Whereas if they abandoned the notion of uniqueness, every class could have a 1 minute minor damage reduction, say 20%, a 2 minute damage absorb, and a 5 minute emergency defensive for big stuff. All healers should also get a strong AoE defensive that can be used for the healing cooldown rotations that are very common in Mythic raids. They could be subtly different, of course, but then everyone gets the tools they need. At the end of the day, if Blizzard makes all classes have to deal with the same mechanics, then they need to make sure everyone has a way of dealing with them. The classes as a whole would still have unique abilities. There would still be no need for obvious commonality with throughput abilities, for example, which is what the defining features of classes should be. In the earlier expansions, all classes were different, but you could switch between specs easily. Each spec still had its own distinct flavour with different strengths. But as things stand, classes are not unique. Even individual abilities are not unique. So what's the reason for this uniqueness crusade? It could actually be that someone very influential at Blizzard genuinely wants it and keeps pushing it against all reason. They might realise that they're not actually doing it, so come up with nonsense justifications for clearly identical abilities because they can't reconcile their philosophy and the reality in their heads. There's a great quote from Doctor Who that I recall. The very powerful and the very stupid have one thing in common. They don't change their views to fit the facts. They change the facts to fit their views. However, it's also possible that this uniqueness crusade came about as justification for all the ability pruning which attracted so many complaints, and now it's gotten out of hand. So now we're in a situation where Blizzard used the uniqueness stick to beat anyone who criticises brainless design philosophies in the same way that class fantasy was used during Legion. It was a deception then, and it's a deception now. Just as they removed long-established icons of class fantasy in Legion, they also have not created uniqueness in Battle for Azeroth. There was never a time when classes overall were not unique, and there is not even close to a situation where individual abilities are unique even now. However you try and compare classes in Mists of Pandaria with Battle for Azeroth, there are no fewer unique abilities now, and there were now more twinned abilities across classes then. As I said at the start of the video, it's all smoke and mirrors. So I hope you found this video interesting. If you didn't, don't forget to give it a like and put your comments down below. I know you're likely to with topics such as this. Subscribe and click the bell icon for notifications of new videos, or just check back each day for new content. Share with others who may also be interested. And until next time, I'll see you later.